Somewhere in the last decade and a half, a very rich person stood in front of cameras, signed their name onto a public promise, and told the world that most of their fortune would eventually be given away. And for a moment, that sounds like the ending of the story. The headlines write themselves. The photos look good. The moral tension resolves in a neat little bow. Yes, the system may be ugly. Yes, the money may be absurd, but look, at least some of it is going back. Then everybody moves on, because a promise made on a stage doesn't need to be kept on a stage. It gets kept, if it gets kept at all, in tax filings, foundation reports, legal vehicles, estate plans, and timelines so long that the people applauding in the room may never actually be around to see whether it happened. So here's the real question, not the headline question. The real one. Do billionaires actually owe us anything? Not legally, not in the sense that a court could force them. I mean in the murkier, more uncomfortable sense. When someone becomes unimaginably wealthy in a society full of roads, workers, customers, schools, laws, subsidies, loopholes, institutions, and luck, and then publicly promises to give most of that wealth away, does that create some moral debt to the rest of us? Or are we just confusing a nice gesture with an actual obligation? That's what this video is about. But the giving pledge actually, the most famous modern version of this question, is the giving pledge. On paper, it's simple. Billionaires, or people who would still be billionaires if they hadn't already given so much away, publicly commit to donate the majority of their wealth to philanthropy, either during their lifetimes or in their wills. The official site currently describes it as a community of more than 250 donors from 30 countries. A culture where rich people are expected to give is probably better than a culture where rich people are expected to hoard without embarrassment. Norms matter. Public pressure matters. Even symbolic commitments can change what starts to feel socially acceptable among elites. But symbolism is doing a lot of work here, because the giving pledge also says, very plainly, that it is a moral commitment, not a legally binding one. It's not a contract. It doesn't impose a public annual payout target. It doesn't say the wealth has to be distributed by a certain age. And because giving can happen during life or through a will, the timeline can stretch all the way to death. Doesn't mean the pledge is fake. It means the pledge is exactly what it says it is, a public moral statement, which is fine, unless the public starts treating a moral statement like completed action. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion lies. Because when somebody says, "I'm giving away most of my fortune," the sentence lands in your head as if the morally important part has already happened. But no, what's happened is a declaration. The hard part is still in the future, and future tense generosity is always easier than present tense sacrifice. The math problem, here's the part people feel intuitively, but don't always stop to calculate. Giving away money slower than it grows can leave you looking generous while staying just as rich or richer. Now, I need to say this carefully, because this is where rhetoric can outrun evidence if you're sloppy. The giving pledge itself is not an oversight body. It does not publish some simple scoreboard showing who is on pace and who isn't. So if we want to talk about the math, we have to talk about the broader pattern, not pretend we have a clean compliance dashboard for every signatory. Stanford Social Innovation Review, citing Bridgespan research, noted that families with more than $500 million in assets gave about *1.2% of those assets in 2017. And when the same analysis was run for 2023, the figure was basically unchanged, even as those assets compounded at rates at or above the S&P 500's long-run average of about *9. In other words, in absolute dollars, giving rose, but as a share of wealth, it stood still. If your fortune is growing faster than your giving, then "I gave more this year than last year" can be true, and "my wealth still became even more concentrated" can also be true. Both can be true at once, and once you see that, a lot of billionaire philanthropy starts looking different, because we often evaluate generosity in raw dollar amounts. 10 million sounds enormous. 100 million sounds almost saintly. But percentages tell a different story. A gift can be huge in ordinary human terms and still be small in relation to the machine producing the wealth behind it. And that's before you get to timing. A promise to give away most of your wealth eventually sounds transformational, but eventually can hide a lot. It can mean decades of delay. It can mean money parked in structures that move slowly. It can mean retaining control over where the money goes, how fast it goes, and under what conditions it goes. So the real question isn't just, was money given? It's also, was control surrendered? And was urgency accepted? And did the giving actually keep pace with the scale of the fortune? Those are much harder questions, which is exactly why they matter. And this is where people usually try to simplify the story into heroes and villains. But I don't actually think that helps, because this isn't just a billionaire story. It's a human story blown up to a grotesque scale. Most people like the idea of being generous more than they like the feeling of loss. Most people would rather make a clean promise than live through a messy follow-through. Most people enjoy being seen as the kind of person who will do the right thing. Billionaires are not unique in that way. They just have the money to turn a common human weakness into a public institution. So when I say the stage moment isn't the same thing as the sacrifice, I'm not saying every rich donor is lying. I'm saying spectacle and substance are not the same category. And wealth lets you buy a lot of spectacle before anyone asks for substance. The best defense of the billionaires, if you want to be fair about this, you have to give the strongest argument from the other side. And the strongest argument is not stupid. It goes something like this. First, billionaires do not legally owe random members of the public their personal fortunes. In a liberal society, once the taxes are paid, the remaining money is theirs to keep, invest, waste, or donate. Charity is voluntary by definition. If it becomes compulsory, it stops being charity and starts being tax policy. Second, giving responsibly can take time. If you deploy billions too fast, you can fund bad ideas, build dependent institutions, distort priorities, or just hand enormous decision-making power to rushed, underprepared teams. Move slower is not always greed. Sometimes it's caution. Third, some donors genuinely do give away vast sums. The fact that the system lacks a neat public scoreboard doesn't automatically mean nobody's doing the thing in good faith. And fourth, there's a basic fairness point. Society loves to praise billionaires when they donate and hate them when they don't. But both reactions assume the public has some claim over wealth that was never formally conceded in the first place. That's the best version of the defense. And honestly, parts of it are right. If your actual argument is the law should force redistribution, then don't smuggle that argument into the language of voluntary generosity. That's a different debate, a serious one, but a different one. Also, giving badly is a problem. There are real critiques of impulsive philanthropy, vanity projects, policy distortion, donor ego, and amateur social engineering. Give faster by itself is not a complete moral philosophy. So yes, the defense has teeth, but it doesn't solve the problem. It just changes what the problem is. Where the defense fails because the moment someone steps onto a public stage and asks for moral credit, we are no longer talking only about private property. We are talking about public image. And if you want public credit for generosity, the public gets to ask what the generosity actually costs you. That's the switch. Nobody has to sign the giving pledge. Nobody has to issue a lofty public letter. Nobody has to frame their fortune as part of a moral mission. The minute you do that, you are not just keeping your money private. You are making a public claim about what kind of person you are and what kind of role your wealth should play in the world. And public claims are open to public evaluation. That's not envy. That's not anti-success. That's just how moral language works. If you stand up and say, I will give away most of this wealth, people are allowed to ask how much, how fast, to whom, under whose control, and is the pile actually shrinking? Because if the fortune keeps rising, if the commitment stays abstract, if the timeline keeps dissolving into the future, and if the donor still enjoys the reputational glow of sacrifice before most of the sacrifice has happened, then the public isn't wrong to feel like something slippery is going on. Not necessarily fraud, not necessarily hypocrisy, but slippage, a widening gap between the emotional meaning of the promise and the material reality of the follow-through. An outside Institute for Policy Studies report made this critique very bluntly, arguing that many original giving pledgers became far wealthier after signing. That's an advocacy report, not neutral oversight, so I wouldn't treat it like gospel. But it does underline the core issue. A public promise to give later can coexist with extraordinary wealth accumulation now. Starts meaning something different, not a legal debt, a credibility debt. So do they owe us anything? No. The giving pledge itself says it's a moral commitment, not a binding one. If what you mean by owe is, can society force them through this pledge to pay up? Then the answer is clearly no. I think the answer is more complicated. I think once extraordinary wealth is built inside a society, using its labor markets, legal protections, public infrastructure, financial systems, state capacity, consumer demand, and social stability, the idea that this wealth is purely self-created has always been a myth. And once that same wealth is publicly framed as something that will be returned, the moral obligation gets stronger, not weaker. Not because applause creates law, because public promises create expectations, and expectations are the currency of trust. If you take the praise attached to generosity, but the sacrifice remains indefinitely deferred, then what people are reacting to is not just inequality, it's asymmetry. The image arrives now, the cost arrives later, maybe much later, maybe after death, maybe in ways the public never really sees. That's not nothing, but it's also not the same thing as giving in the way most ordinary people mean it when they hear the word. Here's where I land. Do billionaires owe us everything? No. Do they owe us through a voluntary pledge something enforceable? Also no. But if they publicly promise to give away most of their wealth, and they accept the admiration that comes with saying that out loud, then yes, I think they owe the public something. Not total obedience, not automatic sainthood, not blind trust. They owe us the right to ask whether the promise is real in substance, or just flattering in theory, because a pledge kept slower than the fortune grows may not be a lie, but it isn't exactly the truth people picture either. It lives in that gray zone where a person can sound morally resolved while postponing the part that actually hurts. And maybe that's the real answer to the question. Billionaires don't owe us everything because they are rich, but the moment they ask to be seen as generous, they do owe us honesty about what that generosity actually amounts to. If you want the next part of this, the names, the numbers, the people who seem to be moving and the people who seem to be stalling, that's the next video.